What happened here?
If you haven't already, smash that like button below and subscribe to the channel to help grow the ministry and fulfill the Great Commission by spreading the gospel to the ends of the earth.
My experience growing up, I had traditional Sunday school, and you'd kind of go through, the major Bible stories, starting with creation, then you get into the fall, then the flood, then you hit the Tower of Babel story. And once you hit that story, it kind of seems like that story doesn't have a whole lot of relevance for the rest of the Bible stories. To me, that was my experience. And you kind of always think of, we talk about the redemptive plan with, hey, we know about the fall. We're undoing the fall in the garden, right? I think that one makes sense to most people. But then we come to this story and say, all right, it happened. All right, moving on. But I think there's a little bit more to the biblical story than most have ever realized, especially to the big meta-narrative of the Bible. So let's just dive right into it with Genesis 11, 1 through 9. Now the whole earth had a common language and a common vocabulary. When the people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. Then they said to one another, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They had brick instead of stone and tar instead of mortar. Then they said, "Come, let's build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered across the face of the entire earth." But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the people had started building. And the Lord said, "If as one people all sharing a common language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be beyond them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they won't be able to understand each other." So the Lord scattered them from there across the face of the entire earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the entire world, and from there the Lord scattered them across the face of the entire earth. At this point, you're like, all right, they're out, spread out, and they no longer can understand each other. They all have different languages. Okay. The main thing that is going on here is that, like Steve said, is that they are rebelling against Yahweh and his Edenic charge of spreading out across the world and populating it with more of his image bearers. And once again, humanity is rejecting his charge and saying to him, we're just going to go our own route, and in a total act of defiance. But to prevent humanity from going beyond the point of no return, like in the pre-flood world, is that the Lord confused their languages and forced them to scatter. Now, we know a little bit more about this story in the prior chapter of chapter 10 in Genesis. I know that's extremely small. And yes, if you were to go look it up in the Bible, you might look at that and say, oh, geez, it's a genealogy chapter. I don't want to read all those names of who begat who and all that kind of stuff. But what I'm going to demonstrate here is that Moses wasn't simply filling up the pages. In each line of Noah's 3 sons is that it says that their lines had their languages and multiple nations were formed from their lines. This is deliberate language here. The final verse in chapter 10 reiterates the division of the nations. This is in reference to the Tower of Babel, when their common language got confused into multiple languages, and then the Lord scattered them across the face of the earth. Another thing you can gather from chapter 10, if you sit there and do a bunch of counting, is that each line has a grand total, when you put them all together, of 70. That is not a coincidence. Now, after the scattering of the nations, what is the Lord recorded doing next in the Bible? The call of Abram. where God told Abraham that he is going to make him a great nation and many descendants will come from him. Essentially, that this is going to be God's nation that he rules over, whereas the other 70 nations were disinherited by the Lord for the rebellion at Babel. Now, I said that the number 70 wasn't a coincidence, and that's because in Genesis 46, God tells Jacob to take the whole family down to Egypt, and that there he will make them a great nation. The fact that Jacob's caravan was 70 is in stark contrast to Babel's 70, and the direct mentioning by Moses wouldn't have fallen on deaf ears to his readers. They would know that this was God taking his 70 down into the most powerful nation in the world at that time with Egypt. Another peculiar thing about the story of Babel is looking at Genesis 11:7's statement about God saying, "Let us go down." Who's the us? Most, I think, in evangelical churches will say that. I'm going to argue that it's a group called the heavenly host. This concept you might not be familiar with, but it does occur a lot in the Old Testament. This is 1 Kings 22:19 through 20, and this is with the prophet Micaiah, and he has a vision of heaven. And up there, he sees God sitting on the throne, and he's having a discussion with the host of heaven about how to handle King Ahab's evil. It's gone beyond the point in northern Israel. We got Jezebel causing a bunch of problems. We got to slow this down. We got to put a stop to this. What are we going to do, guys? And in that discussion, one of them comes up to the Lord and says, "Hey, let's just throw an evil spirit at him to deceive him, and then he'll end up doing what we need him to do." And God looks at him and says, "Good idea. Roll with it." Those 4 verses are tiny, but it's one of those glimpses into heaven of what's going on. Think of the prophet Isaiah, chapter 6. Famous verse says what? "Who will go for us?" And Isaiah says, "Send me, Lord." But in the prior verse, it describes the Lord being the Lord of hosts. It's another vision of heaven. And up there, it's one of those descriptions of describing the seraphim with all the wings. And they bring a coal to Isaiah's lips, and he has lips of unclean lips, and it touches his mouth. Genesis 11's us statement is also not the first one in the Bible. Prior to this, in Genesis 3:22, after the fall in the garden, God said, "Man has become like one of us, knowing both good and evil." So he's having a discussion. We know there's angels in heaven, but most of them are like, "Oh, this is just a discussion between the Trinity happening here." But if you looked at those prior verses, we saw that God is having a conversation with the angels in heaven. And the very first time that this occurred was in Genesis 1:26 with the creation of man. "Let us make man in our image." That's a whole rabbit trail of what exactly is meant by being an image bearer of God. So there's 3 instances early in Genesis that shows that the Lord and the heavenly host are working together. Now, seeing that concept laid out and kind of at the forefront of our minds is now with the division of the nations, the Babel incident, is that things start to get a little clearer because this isn't the only time that Moses brings up the division of the nations. He does so again towards the end of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 32:7 through 9. "Remember the days of old. Consider the years of many generations. Ask thy father, and he will show thee, thy elders, and they will tell thee. When the Most High divided to the nations their inheritance, when God separated the sons of Adam, he set the bounds of the people according to the number of the children of Israel. For the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob is the lot of his inheritance. It's clear that Moses was referring to the division of the nations at Babel, and even said, according to the number of the sons of Israel, which was 70, like in Genesis 46. But if you're looking at here, there's one giant problem with these two texts. Anyone want to take a guess? Israel didn't exist at the time of Babel. There's at least 200 years between those events. Now some might say, well, yeah, but God could just, numerically divide them up 70 because he knew that would match Jacob's 70. Yes, God has foreknowledge. He knows those things. But historically, it doesn't make sense. And if you're a reader in Moses' day and you're looking down at that, that wouldn't make much sense either. Oop. And what I'm really getting at here is that this, in Deuteronomy 32:8, is not the correct ending to the text. In both the ESV and the Berean Study Bible is that they will say, according to the number of the sons of God, not the sons of Israel. The Net Bible and the New Living Version clarify this by making it more explicit in that it is referring to angelic beings by saying the heavenly assembly and court, which is a group that, like I said, you'll read about many times in the Old Testament if you're looking for it. The phrase, the sons of God, first appeared in Genesis 6 when these heavenly beings commingled with the daughters of men that led to the Nephilim, i.e. the giant clans. A lot of denominations today will try and avoid this supernatural reading. I grew up in one of those. But 2 Peter 2:4 directly refers to the angel's sin prior to the flood, and the same is seen in Jude 6 and 7, where the angels are described leaving their spiritual realm and were tagged by Jude with the same violation that occurred at Sodom and Gomorrah. But a note needs to be made here is that these pre-flood sons of God were cast into hell, and that's part of the flood judgment. So, the 70 sons of God that were allotted to the nations is a different group from the pre-flood sons of God that rebelled against the Lord. And this is confirmed when you read Job 1 and 2, when the sons of God came before the Lord in heaven, and Job was written after the flood. And if you think about Job 1 and 2, who also comes in front of God and starts talking? Satan. Job 38:7 has God himself saying that these sons of God are heavenly beings. As he said, they were singing praises to him during the creation of the world. And this verse is talking about prior to the creation of man. Man's not around. It's just heavenly beings at this point. This is another heavenly host scene, which makes it very, very hard, I would say, for a person to argue for a human view. But I'm sure someone is raising their hand because maybe you cracked open a different translation of the Bible and said, hey, look, Brett, a lot of other modern versions still keep saying the number of the sons of Israel, which is the human view. So, gets into a little bit of debate on texts. Which is it? I will argue, obviously, that the sons of God is the correct one for 3 reasons. Archaeologically, the oldest manuscript for Deuteronomy 32 comes from Qumran, i.e. the Dead Sea Scrolls. And those date roughly 200 years before the time of Christ, and it attests to the sons of God angelic view. And 100 years before this, the Septuagint was translated. That's the translation of the Old Testament into Greek. And it says, instead of the sons, it completely replaces the sons part with the word angels, angelos. And the New Testament readers, which includes Peter, Jude, Jesus, this is what they used at that time. Greek was the common language. And they would not have gotten confused as reading across this. Angels, yes. And a third reason is that Moses spoke up on the dividing of the nations earlier in Deuteronomy 4:19 through 20, when God was warning Israelites about not falling into pagan idolatry. He said there, "Unless thou lift up thine eyes unto heaven, and when you see the sun and the moon and the stars, even all the host of heaven, don't get enticed to worship them and serve them, which the Lord thy God has divided unto all the nations under the whole heaven. But the Lord has taken you and brought you forth out of the iron furnace, even out of Egypt, to be unto him a people of inheritance, as you are to this day." The division of the nations is clearly described being allotted to the host of heaven. That cannot be confused with humans, as the whole reference here is things that are up in the heavens, into outer space, and not things on earth. And nor is this simply talking about the forbiddance of astrology. As people, you really can't serve the sun, moon, and stars. They're not talking to you, unless you're eating something really funky. Deuteronomy 17:3 equates the little g gods with the host of heaven. And then in Deuteronomy 29:18, Moses warns the Israelites not to get seduced into serving the gods of the Canaanites. And this is right before they enter into the promised land. He knows what could potentially happen to them, because he reflects back a little bit earlier and says, some of them during the wilderness wandering went apostate still and failed to stay loyal to God. And he says about them in 32:17, they were sacrificing unto devils. So, Deuteronomy 4:19 and 20 perfectly parallels 32:8 and 9. They're one for one. This contextually and textually is consistent when you go back to the book of Exodus even, with God saying he's going to execute judgment on the gods of Egypt. If you go throughout all of those plagues and you look up a chart of the gods of Egypt at that time, these were deliberate, intentional things that God was doing when he was throwing out the curse of the frogs and the locusts and making the sun go dark. Those were not random things. He was saying, I rule everything. I am more powerful than all of your gods that you worship here. And Moses said this was the case also in Numbers 33:4. So, for those three reasons, Deuteronomy 32:8 should read according to the number of the sons of God and not the sons of Israel. The best source on this, and this is really helpful in my walk, has been Dr. Michael Heiser's book, The Unseen Realm. I highly recommend it. He's got a podcast. He's passed away. But in terms of what's going on behind the veil, the supernatural world of the Bible, both Old and New Testament, this is a great book for it.
At this point in the video, if you haven't subscribed already, and the analytics say that roughly 77% of you haven't, go down and hit that free, remind you, free subscribe button. This is the kind of deep dive, scripture-rich content that you're going to get out of every video that I put forward. No milk here, just meat.
Now this supernatural reading makes even more sense coming off of 32:8 when you read verse 9 again. But Yahweh's portion is his people, Jacob is his allotted heritage. So God disinherited the nations back at Babel, gave them over to be ruled by 70 spiritual beings, but that didn't mean that God was done with humanity, just like after the fall. He has a redeeming plan to take them back, and that started with Abraham being called, with him being the progenitor of the new nation under God. Now, if you're looking at this chart, those are nice looking smiley angels over there on the left. And a little bit of a thought is like, okay, so these guys were, God gave them out and put angels over top of them. But he's saying the nations went bad. So Were the angels always bad too? My answer to that is no. Somewhere between Babel and Abraham, they too rebelled. Just like Satan rebelled against God. And the same with the pre-flood angels did as well. And they too became corrupt. And when you look at the Old Testament from Genesis 12 all the way through to the end to Malachi, is that you can kind of call it a big battle, a turf war battle between God and the Gentile nations, or God and the little g gods, and Israel versus the Gentile nations. But how do we figure out when and how do they corrupt? Are you just making it up? No. Psalm 82 has 8 verses, and they say the following. God stands in the congregation of the mighty. He judges among the gods. And now he's going to start talking to them. How long will you judge unjustly and accept the persons of the wicked? Defend the poor and the fatherless. Do justice to the afflicted and the needy. Deliver the poor and needy. Rid them of the hand of the wicked. They know not, neither will they understand. They will walk on in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are out of course. I have said, you are gods, and you are sons of the Most High. But you shall die like men, and fall like one of the princes. Arise, O God, judge the earth, for thou shalt inherit all nations. Verse 1, we see God is first off, he's having a meeting up in heaven, just like we saw with 1 Kings 22. If you were to skip over to Psalm 89, is that you would see the same type of language in verses 5 through 8 that clearly puts heavenly saints up in heaven. And this corresponds really well if you read through the book of Daniel and you get to chapter 4, and we know that that's the chapter in which Nebuchadnezzar goes mad and he's eating grass, for 7 years and such, because he got told, you need to repent. You got to stop this nonsense. And that was coming right after the golden image chapter. He didn't listen, of course. And so one of the things that comes out of heaven, it says, God has rendered judgment on you. And a few verses connected to that, it says, the watchers have also rendered judgment unto you. It's in the same line of thinking. The difference here with Daniel 4's heavenly group and Psalm 82's group is that 82's group went corrupt. God is judging them now. So because of their corruption, God called for a meeting in heaven. I know it sounds a little off, but it is what's happening. And God called the little g gods out who set over the nations and told them they were being judged for not ruling justly. And they were acting corruptly. And as they got worse and more corrupt, eventually they started accepting worship and sacrifices that rose all the way to people in the Canaanites that started sacrificing babies on brazen altars. So if you're reading through the book of Genesis, we always kind of like, Genesis always means what? The book of beginnings, right? It's always that first thing that keeps happening. Babel explains, where did all the paganism come from in the world? They got disinherited out. They got gods set over top of them. Those gods became corrupt, and they started worshiping those little g gods. Paganism is rooted from Babel. The Canaanites went too far and deserved God's judgment. And then he sent in who? Israelites under Joshua's leadership. So because of their rebellion is that God pronounces judgment on them by saying that they're going to die like men. We all know that men die like men. That doesn't make any confusion, but them to die like men, well, that sounds different. They're going to die like men because they're going to be judged and thrown into everlasting chains. So in this statement is that you have God not just pronouncing judgment on them, but you also have him declaring war on them because he knows that they're not going to go down without a fight. same as Satan. And that is the backdrop of the sons of God being stationed over the nations, where the paganism goes spreading throughout the world. To which, if you keep reading in Daniel, is that when you get to chapter 10, it's one of those kind of like, what the heck is going on here? Because Daniel's praying, Gabriel gets to him, and he says, I couldn't get to you because the prince of Persia was withholding me. Until Michael came, pushed him out of the way, so now I can come to you and I can tell you the final prophecy that God has for you. And then he talks about a prince of Greece is coming, and those two are going to duke it out. And now we can think, well, that sounds like Cyrus and Alexander the Great. Yes, historically, Greece and Persia went at it. But can a human withhold Gabriel or Michael? No. So there's a supernatural element here, and I would say this is where it's referring back to the 82 that were at Babel. And this worldview even extends when you get into the New Testament and you start reading through Paul's letters. And we've probably heard this one many times about we don't war against flesh and blood, but we war against the spiritual enemies that are behind the scenes preventing people from coming to faith. The war is over us. People are under the power of the prince of the air, under Satan's control, and we're out battling against those forces. God even says through Paul in 1 Corinthians 6:3, we're going to judge angels one day. You come across those verses like, what? And I would say that this worldview that I'm explaining here right now makes sense of his statement there. But their judgment of death wasn't the only thing God said that was going to happen. He also said that he was going to take back the nations, and he will have authority over them once again. And this worldview adds to messianic verses in the Old Testament, like Psalms 2, where God says his anointed king and son would receive the Gentiles as an inheritance. Psalm 22:27 says, the nations to the ends of the earth will come and worship God. This psalm is a little more famous, probably for the very first verse of it, because it says, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Who said that? On the cross. Jesus was not doubting God up in heaven like, why are you letting this happen to me? He was saying, folks, I'm telling you. Psalm 22, go look it up. I'm telling you the first verse right now. Trigger that in your head. This is the plan. This is part of the redemptive plan. Me up here. We're going to take back the nations. Isaiah 49:6 says that God's servant would be a light unto the Gentiles and a salvation unto the ends of the earth. What's one of probably more famous ends of the earth verses? The Great Commission. Go out and make disciples to the ends of the earth. Daniel 7:14 says that all people, nations, languages will serve the Son of Man, Jesus, in God's everlasting kingdom in 7:14. And a very clear Babel allusion is in Zephaniah, probably not a book that people pop open a whole lot. Zephaniah 3:9, where God says he's going to restore the people with a pure language, not a confused language, so that they can call on the name of the Lord and serve him. This goal of redeeming humanity started back with Abraham's call to be a great nation. But he also told them that all families of the earth will be blessed. This is step one in God's plan to reclaim the nations and reverse the effects of Babel. We ultimately know that God's center point of the redemptive plan is the incarnation of his Son and death and resurrection of Jesus. But another crucial piece is in Acts 2 at Pentecost with the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. And what happened when the Spirit came on them? They spoke in numerous languages. And outside of the upper room is that we're told from people from every nation under heaven are there. And they heard the apostles speaking all of their own languages. Verses 9 through 11 gives us a list. Again, I would say that these things are not there just to fill up the page. It's deliberate. Luke, who most attest to say that Paul was his influence in writing the gospel and the book of Acts, they want you to think of the table of nations from Genesis 10. So in verse 12, when the witnesses out there said, well, what does this mean when we're hearing all these guys speak our own languages? How is that even possible? Is that it means that God's plan to reclaim the nations and reverse Babel's effect is now in full mode with the outpouring of the Spirit. We've been going recently through what 2 chapters in Acts? 10 and 11, which was Cornelius and the Gentiles now being grafted into the family of God. And what happens at the end of 10? The Spirit pours out on them, and they begin to prophesy in tongues as well. This is the pure language that Zephaniah prophesied about, along with the psalmist, Isaiah, Daniel, with God saying, I'm taking them back. We understand how the fall gets undone through the cross. Sin needs to be atoned through Christ. We see Eden restored when you read the book of Revelation. You get that very specific language. No more peace, no more pain, sorrow, evil, disease, death. We're undoing the fall. Within there, we're also undoing the effects of Babel. God is taking back the entire earth, not just geographically, but the people. We are the turf. We are the temple of God, as Paul says multiple times in the New Testament. It's a battle over us. And so Cornelius' story here, I know it's easy to just kind of skim through the book of Acts and not sometimes see the significance of it. But if you're living in that moment, and we talked about how hard it was for Peter and that Jewish versus Gentile mentality and stuff. And you get back to like books of, like Jesus' resurrection appearance on the Emmaus disciples saying, I got to unpack everything to you guys again. Let me show you the whole plan. This is the whole plan. This is how they would read that, is that God is taking everything back now unto himself. And thankfully, he hasn't come back. Because him not coming back allowed what? Us to come into the family of God as well. He didn't just delay the extension all the way across the entire global earth, but also throughout time. It allows us to be born, allow us to be brought back into the family of God as well. He wants Eden. He wants it populated with his people so that we can live their eternity in peace, love, and joy, and happiness. That's ultimately the big meta-narrative of the Bible. Reminder, hit the subscribe button below, turn on the notification bell, hit the like button, and leave a comment. And don't forget to visit us at justscripture.org. But in the meantime, stay salty.